Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I'm conscious that I'm standing between you and beer for the end of the session. I'm going to finish just before 5 o'clock. If you want to talk after that, I don't have a problem with that at all. And you can find me on stand 532, which is the other side. I'm going to talk about a diving fatality that happened 4 years ago. And what I want to do is look at it through the lens of system safety, not just who touched it last, which is what we normally do. I want to understand and help you understand the interdependence that happens within systems and the fact that it's really easy personally and societally to finger point and say it's their fault, but that doesn't really help us learn. So a bit about my background. I spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force. I was a navigator on Hercules transport aircraft, the flight instructor, then went to work in trials, research and development, procurement, and then left in 2015, worked in the oil and gas industry, set up my own business, two businesses, Human Diver, which is about bringing high-performance teamwork, human factors, crew resource management, incident investigation into the diving space. And since then, I've run training courses, face-to-face training courses, more than 600 people face-to-face trained, 2,500 people online, sold a book, or wrote a book, then sold it, and put a documentary together called If Only, that some of you may have seen. I've also been involved in the MOD, who notice are over there, following a fatal diving accident, and also the Kiwi Defence Force, New Zealand Defence Force, following a similar event out there. And then I've run some training with both the Canadian military and also the Belgian military in terms of this human factors training. And all of that, the goal is to try and bring what makes high-risk industries, high-consequence industries safe into a sport, which has lots of challenges to do that. The first one is defining what safety is. And if I put a show of hands of, what safety means to most people, it will be free from harm, it will be free from risk, it will be counting things that go wrong, and then we think, well, actually that's not safe, that's unsafe. So we don't count safety, we can't measure safety. What we do is we measure unsafeties. A better definition of what safety is this from a colleague of mine, Todd Conklin. What he talks about here is it's not just the presence of barriers and defences, rather it's the capacity, it's the presence of those, rather than just counting accidents, incidents, it's the presence of barriers and defences and the capacity of the system to fail safely. And I'll explore a number of these ideas as we go through this session. Easy way to draw this is a Volvo. And when these were the adverts that came out in the 90s, boxy but it's safe. And you sit there going, really? It's not a great term. But that passenger cabin, the whole idea was to protect the people inside it. And you look at why the sort of safety standards of vehicles, very much about that now. So the idea is you can fail, but you fail safely. It's about having resilience, the ability to predict where things go wrong. It's about monitoring our performance accordingly. It's about adapting to the changes that are going on. And then it's about learning so we can then predict a little bit better. And that's really what capacity is about. So one of the things here, I'm going to use 4 different stories to bring different components, or 3 different stories to bring the components of the Linnea Mills case to life. So the first one is about the Challenger, the loss of that. And you could simplify that to say the rules were broken, the space shuttle got airborne, and what happened here at this stage, this is a little image, this is the O-rings in a solid rocket booster vaporizing because there's hot gases, and then 73 seconds after launch, this happened, when the boosters separated and then there was aerodynamic failure of the craft. And often this is pinned on the engineers for not speaking up and not challenging the business decision that was going on. We're also going to talk about 2 Black Hawk helicopters, Army Black Hawk helicopters that were shot down by 2 US Air Force F-15s in northern Iraq as part of the Provide Comfort operations that were going on there. And these were highly skilled aircrew who ended up visually identifying the helicopters in front of them and fired off 2 missiles, one at each of the helicopters, and shot them down. I was sitting there going, these are highly professional, well-trained crews. How on earth can you be in a situation like that? Must be incompetent pilots for that situation. Here is a guy called Martin Bromley, and this is a clip from a documentary that he put, and it's one of the inspirations to me for the diving world, is a documentary called Just a Routine Operation. And I would say, a show of hands, is anybody in the healthcare space in here? Have you seen Just a Routine Operation? Yeah, right. It basically sets the scene for understanding the role of human factors in the healthcare setting. And what happened here is we had an anaesthetist, or a couple of anaesthetists, trying to operate on a patient, and they couldn't intubate, and they couldn't ventilate. So they put her under anaesthetic, her airway had collapsed, and they couldn't get an airline in. And it took a long time for them to realise, oh, this is not going to happen. We probably need to bring her round. In that time that it took, the nurses were coming in going, are you okay? No, we're okay, it's fine, we don't need a bed. And basically, they were so task fixated on this that Elaine Bromley, who's Martin's wife, had brain damage. When they brought her round, or tried to, she was in a coma. And Martin had to give the authorization to turn the ventilator off 3 days later. And he's sitting there going, this is not how it should be. And he turned around and said, so I presume there's going to be investigation. He went, no, it's just one of those things. And he's an airline pilot and said, that's not how we do it in aviation. So this was an inspiration to me. And then we've got Linnea Mills' case, a young lady doing a dry suit speciality as part of an advanced open water class in Glacier National Park in the States in November, cold weather. The diver, she had 45 pounds of lead in her BCD and her dry suit pockets. And I can see people shaking their heads going, really? This is not right. The dry suit was not connected to the single cylinder feed on the back. There were a whole bunch of things that really went wrong, came together at the wrong time. And there's a real sort of finger poking at Debbie Snow, who's the instructor, and I'd love to have a conversation with her to understand her rationality, because I can pretty much guarantee that she didn't go there with the intention of having a dead diver on her watch on that dive. And it must have made sense for whatever reason, her reason, not ours, to do what she did. And I'm going to explore some of those from a systems view. So I told 4 simple stories, 4 linear simple stories, and often they're full of counterfactual, should have, could have, would have. But in reality, this is what the world's like. It's messy. And we need to dig into those second stories, because only when we dig into them do we understand the context and how it made sense. But in the diving space, we don't have a culture that supports this. We don't have processes that support this either, in terms of investigations and learnings that happen. When things go wrong, invariably, the only times they get looked at is a fatality. That becomes a coroner's inquest. And the purpose of a coroner's inquest is to determine the cause of death, not the cause of death. You might have a coroner who's really interested and wants to learn, but most of them are trying to determine what the cause of death is, and they're overworked, they're not got the resources they need. And so it's really easy when we don't have the facts, the data, to jump to assumptions, jump to conclusions and say, this is why they did that. It's like, you weren't there and you don't understand this. Anybody's involved in sort of safety management or management in general, we write procedures, processes, everything is cool. You open the door and go, that's not how it is. And it's a messy world out there, and there's an expectation that people will follow rules because that's what needs to be done to create safety. But that A to B is never intact, it's never complete. You, in your workspace, in your dive space, always finish the design. You get a set of processes, procedures, and it cannot write out exactly what you're going to do. There are little things that experience gives you to solve those problems. I want to ask you to think about is the way that we look at the world. We've got simple linear processes, this domino effect. Take the domino out, everything's okay. This works for simple mechanical systems. We are not simple and we're not mechanical. We talk about complicated systems. Again, it's something that is linear, it's ordered. And if I knock that tower down, I could take those bricks and rebuild it. Your diving equipment, when it goes into for a service, your rebreather goes in for service, the technician's got a manual. He can take the broken component out, scrub it up, fix it, put it back together again, and it works. Hands up here who's got kids? Oh, it's more than that, come on. So you were all kids. Your parents didn't have a manual about how to grow you. It was trial and error. That's what complexity is about. And what we try to do is create things as safe as possible by putting these barriers and defenses in. And this is James Reeson's Swiss cheese model, and it's a dynamic model. It's not static. And those holes, they open and they close, they move around. But when we end up with the dots joining up, we have that adverse event, something goes wrong, it's really easy to go, oh yeah, that's where the failure was, that's where the failure was, that's where the failure was. Because we can see those linkages in real time, looking through time and space. We don't know what the future looks like. We cannot predict with 100% certainty what the future is going to do. So we make it up, we make guesses, and we hope that what we think we're going to do is the right thing to do. Now, one of the models that I've used in my research and the work that's there is something called the Aximap dynamic risk model from Jens Rasmussen. And what he talked about is the fact that we've got guidance and direction top down. So we've got policy, we've got regulations, we've got the company policy, we've got plans how to do stuff, and then people do work. And then those other bodies further up find out what work is supposed to be done, where the gaps are, by having feedback. And that could be incident reports, it could be audits. Now here's a perfect system where everything is where it should be. That never exists in the real world. What does happen is people look top down, that looks cool, but they miss all the holes in this. And those gaps create risk. They create the potential for loss. Unfortunately, we as humans finish that design. We're the ones who make it safe in real time. So the first of those stories I'll go back to is Challenger, where this term, the normalization of deviance, came from. It's not, and those who are Americans or Canadians in the audience, it's not the normalization of deviation. That's just a bastardization of it. It's this bit that actually they had modified their clearances processes. So the bit here is no rules were violated, there was no intent to do harm. And this comes from a book called Launch Decision by Diane Vaughan. She spent many years looking into this. And the idea here is that they got risk management processes that they would sign off and say, this is acceptable, this is acceptable. A friend of mine coined the phrase, Challenger was risk managed right to the point it exploded 73 seconds after launch. It's like, that's acceptable, that's acceptable. On the very first launch, the O-rings that were involved, and they're not little O-rings, these are huge diameter O-rings, and they're only a few millimeters apart. So the margins are really small. So it's not about the rule breaking, it's the social construct in the situation. And in diving, it's a social activity. Another bit to consider is a story that illustrates how disastrous consequences can emerge from the banality of organizational life. Just work is normal, it's boring, stuff goes on, and most of the time it doesn't go wrong, and therefore we think it is okay. And a final bit from the Challenger decision is this idea, or Challenger launch decision, is this idea of structural secrecy. So each one of the departments that were involved in this, the NASA engineers, the Solid Rocket Booster Company, the government departments, every sort of stakeholder was operating in their own little silo. And this quote here from a guy called Richard Cook, he came in as an advisor, he started looking at this stuff and go, you do realize your risk margins are being eroded. And it's like, who are you? You're not an engineer, you're not an aerospace engineer, what do you know about this? And I have this feeling a lot in the diving industry. I'm not a diving instructor, what do I know about safety in diving? You know what, I don't know much about diving instruction. I've been a student for a number of classes, but I know quite a lot about human factors and system safety. And there's margins being eroded all over the place, but we only count dead bodies in the diving space to say something is safe or unsafe. And so the other piece that came out from another paper was, over time, this shifted from an experimental system that basically said, convince me why I should launch this, to convince me why I shouldn't launch this. And this is a discussion I had at DEMA a number of years ago, talking about bailout rebreathers, side mount rebreathers. What are we going to do about these? And the conversations were all about innovation, experimentation, exploration. I get that. But these are also commercial products that we sit there and go, hey, nobody's died, therefore it must be okay. And my view is the other way around. But I'm a bit risk averse compared to what else is going on. So the other bit, we talk about the organisation that didn't learn. This is Columbia, and the failure that happened a number of years later. They didn't learn as NASA as an organisation. The organisational failures, quality management and drift, carried on through. And there's a great report here that's worth downloading. But people don't learn. There's a research paper that I used in my own research looking at using a US Coast Guard scenario. They got given an O-ring type problem, and most people went, yeah, we'll launch, it'll be okay. Even if they realised that if the aircraft failed, they'd have to ditch in icy waters and the crew would likely drown or get hypothermia. And so we don't learn. They knew about this scenario, but they don't learn. And that's what I've asked, and you don't have to read all of these. These are just some of the ideas that I've come up when it talks about the normalisation of risk and the normalisation of deviance and the shifting that's happened. Gas density that's there, reduced time for training. What does mastery mean when it comes to instruction? There's a whole bunch of these things that are there. And my bit, risk transfer to insurance companies. When things go wrong, it's not a personal thing. The insurance company will pay out. And that doesn't actually help us improve things because we're managing liability, not operational risk. So we'll move on to the shoot down in Iraq. 3 key players in this: airborne warning control system, F-15C, a pair of those, and the targets, unfortunately, were the UH-60 helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters. Now, this was at the end of the Iraqi war. They then moved into a peacekeeping operation, and they moved from high-tempo operations to things that weren't at risk. People were itching to get stuff done. Nobody had had any Iraqi aircraft come into the area, and so they were getting a bit bored. These guys, egos, fast jet guys, air-to-air guys, desperate to have something happen. And each one of these different stakeholders had created margin. They created some sort of slack in their own system. They modified their own procedures. Nothing had gone wrong because it was slow tempo operations. But on this particular day, the AWACS picked up a couple of helicopters, and then they disappeared. And just as they disappeared, they handed over in the AWACS to another controller, who then saw these come up and think, new contacts. Vectored in the 2 F-15s to go and visually identify the aircraft. The electronics that should have identified the aircraft weren't working for different configuration reasons, and they flew by these 2 Black Hawks and went, visually identified. And then they cleared to engage because they shouldn't have been there, itching to basically shoot the aircraft down. They flew by, and then as they came back in again, they said, confirmed, loosed off the missiles, shot the aircraft down. They were all operating in their own practical drift space. So each one of the young units had got space, and they'd expanded their space, and it's fine. But to go from everything's hunky-dory to it's all gone horribly wrong was a matter of minutes. And that slack that they got, that space, just collapsed. And they ended up misidentifying this for this. And one of the reasons for this is these F-15s, their visual identification cards were photos taken without external fuel tanks, and they were taken from the front. Very different to what one of these things looks like. Now you come and fly past this thing at 360 knots from the tail, so you're now doing 1 mile every 12 seconds. That's or every 10 seconds. That's a fast closure speed. And they went, hind hit, and then they shot them down. And this is a quote from Scott Snook's book, where he said, the more I went looking for people, the more I found it was normal people doing normal work in a normal organisation. They were all doing what made sense to them. So bringing it into the human factor space, I explained a little bit about Martin Bromley's case, but Martin went on to set up a clinical human factors group, and about 3 or 4 years ago, the Health Services Safety Investigation Board was set up. They didn't have an independent investigation board like the Air Accident Investigation Board, the Marine Accident Investigation, Maritime Accident Investigation Board. And now they're starting to look at bigger systemic issues rather than the last person to touch it. We don't have any of this in the diving space. So we're thinking about practical drift on the previous ones where instructors or divers, they basically stretch what the limits are, which is great, until time gets really tight and it all goes horribly wrong. Now, what I'm going to do is explore this idea of the gap between what should happen and what does happen. So I'm going to set up a training program, and I've got an idea about what that training program looks like, and then I document it. Now that work as prescribed, that documentation, is always a subset of this, and that's often based on optimal conditions. The right weather, the right people, they're all pretty experienced, everything is working to plan. And the problem is that we've got two sets of work that happens, and we describe those. The one on the top is if we've got a punitive environment, a punishment-based environment, and I go up to this gentleman and say, how do you do your work? He will tell me what's written in the book, because he knows that he's going to get punished if he doesn't follow the standards. Sounds familiar in the diving space? Work is done is actually if I go up to him and say, what's going on? He tells me all of the challenges that are faced. Workarounds, adaptations, modifications, because the results are what gets measured. And if we only look at the measures and the outcomes, we don't find out those gaps. And if we've got psychological safety, which is this shared belief that it's okay to speak up, make a mistake, challenge, and we've got a just culture which allows us to learn and understand from events, then we can close that gap. But from an organisational point of view, that's risk. You're never going to get it to zero, but you can get it to be smaller, and you can then try this bit here. You can't fix a secret. What we're trying to do is identify all the gaps that are there, and that's really hard. It's really hard in the diving industry because of the globally diverse environment and the fear of litigation that exists. So what I wanted to do is my research for 2 years, which graduated last June, was about understanding the factors that influence storytelling to learn. And the subtitle of the research, it was called Storytelling to Learn, What Happens Underwater Stays Underwater. And that's one of the big differences, is that when things happen to you or you and your buddy, then you might surface like, don't tell anybody about this. Like, it didn't happen. Like, really? Somebody might learn about it, yeah, but we don't want to be made fun of. And what I ended up finding was sort of 8 key areas, and they sat under this organisational cultural factors and the event. And sort of zooming in on this side, social, cultural, organisational factors. What sets the divers, instructors up for certain behaviours? There's a fear of retribution, fear of failure, fear of being judged, commercial imperatives. How much trust exists between divers, dive instructors and the dive centre manager, dive instructors and the training agencies, the regulators that are out there, across social media? If we don't have trust, we don't find out these stories. And then there's this tension between learning, so we share those stories, litigation, now somebody's going to use that against me, and then speculation. Can we write a story that might be, this might happen? But you're being sort of judgmental and you're putting people down. It's like, no, I'm hypothesizing what might happen and asking the question, could it happen to me? And if the answer is no, you then got to follow up with why. What are we putting in place to prevent that? So that's on one side. And then on the other side is, what does an event or an incident actually mean? There wasn't consensus of that. The context. People really didn't understand the context of how an event developed and how it made sense for those people at the time. How to tell a learning-focused story. Nobody teaches you how to create an environment where you can get those facts out there and create learning. And then the final bit is, how do you share that story? And we have the British Tobacco Club Instant Reporting System, but it's very simple, it's very narrow, very linear, and the same with the DAN system. When you put things out into online forums, people start throwing rotten tomatoes at you for being a stupid diver, because it was obvious that was going to happen. Any time you read, it would be obvious, if it was that obvious, somebody would have spotted it before it went wrong. So it might be obvious to you because you know its relevance, but in real time you don't. So what does an incident mean? So, this was a popular response from a survey. Deviation from the plan. Hands up here who has followed all of their dive plans to the letter all of the time. There we go. So everybody deviates. You have to. Because no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and the enemy's the water or the wreck or the cave. Potential for harm or actual harm. We are in an inherently hazardous environment. Hands up here who's got gills. Cool. Nobody. So when you run out of gas, you're pretty poorly placed. So this bit of, diving is safe. No, it's not. And that upsets people because, it's safe, sexy, accessible sport for everybody. No, there is an inherent hazardous space there. Near misses. Now, an interesting bit here is people often celebrate near misses. Hey, look, I was really good at that. I got by. And they don't look at the context. They don't realize what train wreck was lying behind them because they don't run a debrief and they don't have an instant investigation process. And what's the focal point? Invariably, last to touch it. So one of these sort of things that came to mind as I was teaching a class a couple of years ago is you can't reflect in the moment until you've reflected on the moment. So when you're in the here and the now, unless you've encountered that situation and how it developed, you're not going to be able to learn effectively. And one of the bits that was a real surprise, out of 650 odd people who completed the survey, there was only 2 people who said an incident provides an opportunity for learning. So they're going, incidents provide loads of opportunity for learning, but if people aren't looking for them, then we won't go look, we won't find them. What does risk mean? And what was interesting here is the different perceptions. And I suppose if I thought about it, it was kind of come out. But this is what the different communities of practice that I had, closed circuit rebreather, open circuit tech, recreational cave divers, this is what they thought risk meant. This is what instructors thought risk meant. And it was about freedom from liability. So this is about litigation and liability. And we end up with Tech Clark, who's a colleague of mine, I know him, and I've seen his class here. His class is a liability limiting class, not a risk management class. And the reason why I bring that to the fore is that we are not managing risk in the diving space, we are managing uncertainties. Risk is managed through numbers. We don't know the probabilities of these events occurring, but we have a heuristic, a shortcut, a mental shortcut bias that says, I heard about that story, therefore it's credible. So what we're using is system 1, system 2 of naturalistic decision making to sit there and say, I haven't heard about that, therefore it's safe. Or I heard about it, somebody recovered it, and therefore it's not catastrophic. We also need to have to understand risk always has an element of reward. So actually we should be talking about loss and reward, not risk and reward. So understand what's the reward. You will go diving to explore the underworld world. That could be caves, wrecks, photography. It's about getting a positive benefit. You might have traveled halfway around the world to go and do an expedition. The reward is there. I don't want to lose out on that. There are a bunch of biases that prevent us from seeing this in obvious states. Next bit is organizational fear. So we're talking about the unknown around human factors. What does that mean to help us reduce adverse events? Being judged by peers, they're there. Lots of market share. This was one of the things I was really surprised at, but again, makes sense. A number of organizations I've approached to bring human factors training in won't bring it in because it becomes an impact to a commercial element. So if 4 agencies are out there and an instructor candidate's looking to see which agency's there, if one of them mandates human factors training, you sit there and go, there's 3 over there, they don't have that extra bit, I'll go for the easiest route. And that means you lose market share. I get it. But it was a bit like, it's a bit odd. Willful blindness is knowing about stuff and not doing anything about it. And then folk stories. There are so many times people go, oh yeah, this litigation happened. Really? Can you tell me when? Nah, but it's like one of those boogie stories that's out there. And that shapes our behaviours, the culture that's there. Culture of learning. In the cave diving community, they talk about accidents all the time. It's part of the cave training process. In the recreational and the technical diving space, it doesn't happen in the same way. Compliance, there we go, we shape people, we tell people you have to follow the rules because that's what you're going to do to remain safe, but it's not necessarily the case. And the altruistic nature of shared learning. What this means is I have to expend energy and time to share my learning to somebody else, but I've learned that myself. I ain't going to make that same mistake again. Yeah, but I ain't going to make all those mistakes myself. I can learn from others, and that's where aviation, why it's as safe as it is, because we can learn from other people's mistakes, including all of the context that's there. So this piece here is people do something to them that superficially looks like analysis in the hopes that the absolution, it can never happen to me, will come. So I'll sit there and go, I judge, and I'll basically look at that, and I protect myself from maybe the fear of having an event themselves. What does an incident mean? If you go looking for human error, you're looking for diver error, you're looking for complacency, you'll find it. And that's the sad situation. We have to change the language. So how do we get feedback within the system? This is the diving system, and what should happen is across there, but actually those bits are broken. We probably only get 5, 10, 15% of what's really going on out in the diving space. And that means that the training agencies can't do the work that needs to be done. And I would argue they may not want to do that anyway. And that's one of the bits that came out, was a system does what it's designed to do. We've got different perspectives of this. Both of those are true. This is intent. You know, somebody puts this on the floor, somebody must have put it on there, but we interpret it differently. And what I was coming to is this bit, that here are all the training agencies, and I don't know if there's anybody in the sort of senior within the training agencies, don't have a problem with that. What's the purpose of the training system? Is it for safe diver, or is it for revenue generation, or is it for a community piece when we've got club environments? My argument would be that it's about managing and getting students through to graduate from classes, not necessarily about teaching them how to dive in the real world. And when we start mapping commercial pressures on that, that becomes very clear that that's the case. Now, there are volunteer organisations I know, and so the commercial element doesn't come into that, but resources are often tight, and can we get people through? So the compliance piece is a couple of links. Anybody who wants a PDF of this or they want the links, come and see me at 352. I'll get your email address and I can send you some stuff. But this is a presentation I gave at Diving Talks in Portugal 3 years ago. And this idea that we believe that if people follow the rules, everything is safe. And on the right-hand side, there's a professor from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, Drew Ray, and he talked about the fact that false assurance, if we follow all the standards, everything must be safe. But we've got to have some feedback mechanism. And that brings me sort of close into the Linnea Mills case. So I've set the scene to talk about the number of failures that could happen in a complex system. And what we're trying to do is drive the probability of this event. And in this case here, it's a drowned diver due to being overweighted, not having buoyancy. We put as many things, barriers and defences, training protocols, systems, communication, teamwork, to drive that as close to zero as possible. But because we've got these pesky humans in the way who are just unreliable, you're never going to get to zero. So let's sit there and go, how do we reduce the likelihood that this becomes a fatal situation? That could be O2, it could be an emergency action plan, understanding, could be teamwork, and we talk about learning outside. So learning in the task, the ability to speak up, learning afterwards due to a just culture that allows us to understand the context and then apply the learning. So digging now into Linnea Mills' case here, Debbie Snow's the instructor, inexperienced, given she had, and the data that I'll talk about comes from the lawsuit that was filed and the data that's available in the public record. So she took her 2 goes to pass her instructor exam at a PADI IE, and there was talk about her being overweighted. The goal, the class itself, was an advanced open water class, but there's also a dry suit speciality running at the same time with somebody else. The dry suit speciality student had undertaken some of the orientation and pre-pool training. The difference between a dry suit speciality and an adventure dive: the dry suit speciality has 6 pages of notes, the adventure dive has half a page of notes about how to run that dry suit course. You didn't need to be a dry suit instructor to be able to teach a dry suit adventure dive. Time pressures that were there. This was the last time they would be able to dive before winter set in, and then it was going to be February time. The day itself, they set off from the dive centre at 11 o'clock in the morning. Bear in mind this is November, short days anyway. What was supposed to be a 3-hour drive turned into a 4.5-hour drive. They arrived an hour and 15 minutes before sunset. The lake is in the bottom of a valley, unsurprisingly. And it would get darker earlier. They needed to get stuff done. There were short times for the dives. People were cold. There was still snow and ice on the ground. People needed to be in the water quickly and out again. And it's about getting the certifications done, because for an instructor, the more certifications you get, the more credibility you have. And so actually one of the bits that was picked up afterwards is the number of certifications that were issued post-event, even though the dives didn't take place. And this speaks to a sort of quality management process at a higher level. Multiple equipment changes and issues. One of the big things here was that Linnea had bought a dry suit which got picked up the day before this class. She'd been diving in BC, rented from the dive centre, and the connection nipple on the dry suit feed didn't match the inflator hose that was on the dive gear. So you've just driven 4.5 hours, you're really excited to get there, and it's like, oh, it shouldn't be too bad. We're only going to do, say, a 6-metre, 20-foot dive. It will be all right. And you sit there and go, but if you're an inexperienced instructor, you don't necessarily know the consequences of this. So they got in the water with the dry suit feed disconnected. The instructor hadn't done any weighting checks because of time limits. They hadn't done anything in the pool, in that configuration. So there wasn't an integrated weight set. They were just dead weights, like normal pocket weights, lead weights. They were zipped into the pocket, and then there were extra weights put in the dry suit pockets because they had no idea how much lead was needed to dive this drive. So 45 pounds of lead on that diver. And it was a 25-pound BCD that would be able to provide the lift. And there's no way of getting air into the dry suit to provide that feed. So the training system's optimized for reselling. It's all about do the next course, do the next course, do the next course. And you read the sort of the narrative about what happened. And Linnea Mills, she'd only done 5 dives prior to this. And there was lots of commentary online going, she should have known better. She was a diver. She should have questioned this. 18-year-old girl, 5 dives, dead keen to go diving. And your instructor goes, let's go diving. Okay, cool. And there's trust that goes up that way. You believe that that's the case. And I'll show a short video in a minute about the role modeling that's going on. Inexperienced students and staff, there were a number of people who were signed off as being a DM or guiding, and they weren't qualified to do so or experienced to do so. And then conflicts and confusion in the training materials. What does a dry suit adventure dive look like compared to a dry suit speciality? So it's not just point the fingers, there's a whole bunch of other higher level factors. And in fairness, a number of those issues were addressed after the fatality and the court case. Unfortunately, the big one for me is the self-certification process that many of the agencies, if you've got enough experience, you can self-certify and now teach that class. How does that sit with quality management? And I have a massive issue with that. But hey, I'm just an annoying person in the corner. Dunning-Kruger effect. You don't know what you don't know. And even worse, you don't know that you don't know. So when Debbie Snow ran that program, unaware of the risks. You cannot do risk management if you don't understand the hazards. And if the hazards haven't been explored and explained, then you're not going to detect them. And that's the key bit, is hazard and risk are different. Hazard's the bit that's going to harm you. Risk is the probability and the consequence to be had. So I'm hoping that this comes out. It should do, because I played it earlier. This is Bob Gentry who's the guy that rescued or tried to rescue Linnea as she sank down. And this is a partner, and this is on Dive Talk YouTube channel. And so what I've done is I've taken a 2-minute section out of here. And the reason I put up here running the hurdle race is because just think about when you're if you ever did hurdles and you try and run them, you knock them over, but you're trying to finish, you don't look back at the things that have failed. When you get to the end of the race, you can see the mess. But when you're in it, it's all about running forward.
Okay. I would like to preface this whole thing with the idea that I know that as I begin to tell my story, there's going to be bells and whistles go off to everybody that hears it. I was there, and these things, I did have second thoughts. There were things that were driving my motivation, such as I was trying to get my daughter and I certified for dry suits since the end of spring. And this thing kept dragging on and dragging on. Unbeknownst to me at the time, it was because of Chris's leaving and Debbie taking over, and Debbie's organizational skills lacked. And I wasn't aware of that. There was always just excuses, and things went on and on and on. So everything drug out quite a bit. So I was wanting to get this finally done. The other thing is just the bravado of, I've dove all sorts of weird circumstances and have had issues with other dive partners. And, I figured I could handle things. That's not a great excuse, and it's not what you want to do, to lay safety aside because you think you can handle it. But when you think you can handle it, you're too ignorant to know otherwise. And I accept that fact. And, the other part is that, here was this woman that should have been a great example to my 14-year-old daughter. That the reason I cherish diving is that I got certified when I was 16, and it opened a door in that I felt I was capable of doing anything. And because of that attitude, it led to me being able to do a lot of stuff. That fear of the reason you don't accomplish things in life is a fear of not trying. So you don't try, so you automatically fail. And so that's what scuba diving gave to me in all walks of my life. And I cherished it. And so I wanted that experience for my daughter. My daughter was certified at 13. And, then we went to the dry suit class. And this was going to be an opportunity to take my young daughter and help mold her to be a successful person. And I thought a woman diver would be a great example for my daughter. So those three things, and probably others, but those three things really allowed me to I just kept stepping over all the problems as they appeared in this situation. When you get done hearing it, you're just not going to believe it's possible. But anyway, and then the second thing is when you guys try to friggin' give these comments of I should have this, I should have that. In this circumstance, I got 4 years of every day thinking I should have this, I should have that. You're not going to come up with anything new. And as of yet, Linnea is still gone. It hasn't solved anything. So if you want to do that in the comments, that's fine. But, really, you have, I'll be beating myself up when you've long forgotten about this story. It will live with me forever. So, you don't have a chance to out what if me, not in this circumstance.
And that's one of the things that the diving industry doesn't do, and that's provide trauma support for professionals and individuals. Dr. Laura Walton, who's based up in Edinburgh area, she dives out of Fifth Point Dive Centre, does provide that capability to the UK. Fit to Dive is her website, and she provides that support. But when you're in that situation, nobody helps you. You having to process that on your own. And the trauma doesn't have to be as big as this. It could be a rapid ascent. It could be a fear of drowning when you clear your mask. So I'll put this in the Facebook group, the link that's there, but it's a really powerful piece, and it's really sad, because you hear this, and you know that there are people going, eep, 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 eep. Hands up here who saw me last year give a presentation. I gave a presentation in the third person. I talked about a diver who had basically got aura from decompression sickness, and then flew home from Malta the following day. And I told it in a sort of judgmental way, and I set the audience up and I said, so what do you think about that diver? And they went, and I went, that diver was me. And everybody looks at their feet. When you have the conversations with people and you understand the rationale, it's a really powerful piece. But we don't create that environment in the diving space. So looking back to, the number of the factors that were there, disorganized admin from a dive center, look at these as an individual level. Are they normal? Have you experienced them before? Time pressures, combining courses, incomplete missing feedback, short dive times to meet that. This is a brilliant one. If you measure the experience of somebody by the number of dives they have, and a dive only has to be 20 minutes, as soon as you make a minimum, a target, that's it. People will do a load of 20-minute dives to count. Overweighted divers, maybe not to 45 pounds, but the number of instructors I know, especially tech instructors, cave instructors, who reduce or take 10 pounds or so off people, 55 kilos. Incorrect gear configurations, modifying the gear, inexperience on that equipment or roll. All of these are pretty normal, but it's when you put them all together, we go to that practical drift, and you collapse the system, you end up with a fatality. And we need to address these things, not the end outcomes. And that requires us to change and take a different perspective. And this little animation sort of brings it to life. It's the same thing, but we need to view it from a different direction. Adverse events happen as deviations from normal, not from the rules. Sometimes the rules and normal are the same, but often they're not, because you can't get the job done after all. What does normal look like? What's changed in that situation? And unfortunately, a lot of the situation we're in is who is last to touch it. And anybody who comes via 532, you'll see a Jenga tower, and it's a discussion point. Pepe, who's filming this, says, look at what you're leaving for me. Now, unfortunately, Andreas pulls the brick out, the tower collapses. But was that Andreas' fault that the tower collapsed when he pulled the brick out? People go, yeah, well, he had a choice. And now you put that in, say, a commercial setting or a social setting, where there's a huge amount of commercial or peer pressure to conform. Is that really a choice now? And that's what I'm trying to do, is explore these things. So, and that final bit here is safety is measured by its absence, not its presence. What we've got to do is understand what it is that we're looking at. And this series of images builds, and it's not really clear what it is until we get to here. And then we can put the whole thing together, and that's why debriefs are so important and incident investigations are so important, so we can reflect on what's happening. Now, there we go, that's my time, which hits the takeaways. It's messy out there, it's not linear, everybody doesn't follow all the rules all the time because they can't. Compliance only gets you so far. We complete the design that's there, because you can't write everything. And if you wrote everything down, nobody would follow the rules anyway, nobody would read it. The actual incident itself is often uninteresting. It's the conditions and the context that surrounds that. The fact that somebody's overweighted and drowns we know that that's the case. Causes of death don't often help us learn. It's about the social and technical conditions that are there. Change the language. Don't ask, why did you do that? Ask, how did it make sense? We have to shift the language to be more curious than judgmental. We need to develop that second story, the messy story, and that takes time and it takes education to be able to understand those factors. Because without feedback, we can't improve. It doesn't matter what goes on, and fundamentally, there are lots of secrets that are out there that could really help other divers. But then we get this sort of ego, protectionism, selfishness. I'm not going to share my story. I know where I screwed up, and I don't want other people to know where I screwed up. But actually, they might be able to learn from you. and fundamentally be better than yesterday. This ties in with Lanny's presentation tomorrow morning. There's another human factors, human diver instructor on this stage, first presentation tomorrow morning. And he's going to talk about a number of cave events and how, and actually wider than cave events, incident analysis and how we can learn from those. Final bit, is if you want to take a picture of that slide, there are resources. Come and find us on 532, and there's a bunch of pens, stickers, wet notes, copies of Under Pressure, and all of this stuff is online in terms of self-paced e-learning and face-to-face. See everybody sat down, take pictures, and that's it. Questions, comments, thoughts? 2 minutes over, sorry, but trying to answer questions up here, and enjoy the beers and whatever you're doing tonight, and come and find us later. Thank you.